This is part of the old Roman road that Paul would have walked on his way to be martyred. Inside this church marks the place where St. Paul lost his head. We'll see the pillar and also a picture of that sad event. Here we have the Church of the Martyrdom of San Paolo. That Paul walked on his way there. You can still see that part of the original Roman road. In the back corner there, behind the grating, the fence there, you'll see the pillar where Paul was executed. Can we close the Luca, can you close the door? Thank you. And you'll see behind the grating there a column, and this is the place where Paul was actually executed. And then it's Tre Fontane comes from the Italian three fountains. When Paul's head was cut off, it rolled down the hill and three fountains sprang up water. And you'll see the three altars here, and sometimes you can still hear the water gurgling underneath those altars. Just a real quick overview of his last days. Paul was arrested and taken to Rome at the end of the book of Acts. And he was in house arrest for 2 years at 1960, the year 62 AD. And then he was released, and he went back out for another 5 years doing evangelism, planting churches. He went all the way back to Ephesus, to Corinth, and he ended up even going to Spain, the far ends of the world. And then he came back to Rome, or actually he was in Ephesus, and Nero, the brute who killed his own mother, arrested Peter and Paul because of the fire of Rome. Rome burned. It was started by Nero, but he made the Christians the scapegoat. And he went and arrested the Christians, and he picked the two Prince of the Apostles, Peter and Paul. And in the year 67 AD, they were thrown into the Mamertine prison where we were yesterday. And they were down in that disgusting prison, which was a cistern, which was a hole, basically, and then it was a big underground cavern, and you would be just dropped down into that hole. For hundreds of years, they had kept prisoners there, and when you were dropped into that hole, you knew you were a dead man. And you would fight over scraps of food that would be thrown down. There would be no fresh air or water or a breeze because you're down in a hole. It would stink. No janitors went down to clean that place out. You knew you were a dead man. And if you wanted to know what St. Paul was thinking while he was in that prison, you read the book of 2 Timothy, where he's writing his last will and testament to his very faithful and loyal follower named Timothy, who had become a convert at the preaching of St. Paul. And he was one of Paul's most dedicated and loyal followers. And then Paul was dragged out of that prison one morning after telling Timothy, I have run the race, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith. Remember in the book of Philippians, he said, I have not yet attained to the resurrection, but I struggle, I fight, I'm working towards that end. But here in 2 Timothy, he writes and said, I have now attained the goal. I've reached the end. I've kept the faith. And awaiting me, see all these sports metaphors, awaiting for me is an incorruptible crown of life. What does he mean by that? Well, he had earlier talked to us about how runners in the Olympics, they trained for years, 4 years. They trained every day, and they ran completely naked in the Olympics. And they tried to work so hard to prepare for that. And the reward was a piece of celery that was wrapped around your head, which would fall off and rot in a few days. But that's what they worked 4 years to win that crown of celery. And Paul says, how much more will we do? We are running the race. We are finishing the course. We have this incorruptible crown. That's why he also says, cast aside everything. You know, these guys ran naked. And he's using that as an example. If you are training 4 years and you have all these robes on and sandals and a thong breaks on your sandal, you get tangled up in your robe, you fall, and all that training has been wasted. Cast aside everything. Throw away everything. Don't let anything get in your way, and run. Sin. Get rid of it. Get rid of selfishness and all the greed and things that keep us away from God, and run the race. And that's what Paul's saying. I finally finished the course because they're going to take me out to the Ostian way now and cut off my head. He knew he was being poured out as a sacrifice, as an offering to God. And one misty morning, they pulled Paul up out of that prison, probably a great surprise to him because people were just left to die in there. And they bring him out from that prison all the way out here to outside of the city walls. And they bring him up that Roman road that we just walked to, and there was that pillar there. And the executioner, I think his name was probably Brutus, about 300 pounds with a ring in his nose and tattoos all over his body, pulls his sword out 200-pound sword, he does it every day. He's covered with blood from yesterday. And he pushes Paul down over there on the road and goes off with his head. And that's the end of St. Paul. Do not stop it, because the lions are my way to God. I am like the fine grain that will be ground up with the lion's teeth into the fine bread of God. Very Eucharistic. And I will become the fine bread of God. Don't stop the lions. Paul wouldn't have had that stop there. He knew that he was going to God. It was an honor to be a martyr for Jesus Christ. We in America, we have it kind of cushy. We don't like pain. I don't like pain. But you know, we've got to think about the fact that our world is changing and that we have to put God first in everything we do. And I tell my kids, I have 12 grandchildren now, and I tell my kids that I want you to raise my grandchildren to be martyrs. And little Maria Faustina says, "But Grandpa, why do you want us all to die?" And I said, "I don't want you to die, Maria Faustina, but I want you to know that there are some things more important than giving up Jesus Christ. You never do that. And if you have to die to hold on to Jesus Christ and his church, don't give it up." And so Paul's head was cut off there. When it bounced, it rolled down, the three fountains came. The believers came and took his body, and for a while it was buried in the catacombs of St. Sebastian for safekeeping, because there were persecutions and they would raid places. So they kept them safely away in the catacombs of St. Sebastian. And we don't have time to go there, but if you come back with us again sometime, there is 614 graffiti marked on the wall in one little place, and that's how they know that right behind that wall was the bones of Peter and Paul, because scratched into that in Latin and Hebrew and Greek are the words Petros y Paulos, pray for us. Nike, N-I-K-I. We wear Nike shoes and don't even know what it means. It's a Greek word that means victory. And so the people would come there, the early pilgrims, to this place, and they would scratch in there, "Please, Peter and Paul, you ran the race. You died for Jesus. You were faithful right to the end, but now we're the ones that are being persecuted. We're the ones being tortured. We're the ones being martyred. Please pray for us that we'll have victory." Nike. And there's 614 of those scratched into that wall. And then after the persecutions were over, they took the bones of Peter and Paul out of there, and they brought the bones of St. Peter to here out to the church where we're going. Next after this, the Church of St. Paul outside the walls, where you'll see the sarcophagus down under the altar where Paul's bones are. And they took Peter. What you see here, they crucified him upside down in the Vatican, which was called the Vatican long before there was a Vatican. It was just a marshy land, and there was a arena, a circus that Nero built there, and Peter was crucified upside down in Nero's circus, and his bones ended up at St. Peter's, where we'll be later today. So you're going to be today at the two churches of the bones of the two princes of the church who shed their blood and really kick-started the church. They really did by doing that, Peter and Paul. Now, when we go to the church, I probably won't have time to talk to you at the next church, but you'll see the bones of, you won't see the bones, but the sarcophagus where Paul's bones are. But there's also a chapel that is built just from the front altar over to the left side, and the transept there's a chapel to St. Stephen. And I remember going there and saying, why is there a chapel to St. Stephen in the Church of St. Paul's bones? And then I remembered, when Stephen was the first recorded Christian martyr, what did Stephen do before he breathed his last? He prayed for his executioners that they'd be forgiven. Who was there being prayed for? Saul of Tarsus. And St. Augustine said, if it were not for the prayers of St. Stephen, the church would not have St. Paul. So this is just wanted to give you an introduction to the end of Paul's life, because we're going to be living that today. And as we go to celebrate Mass now, just so you're aware of where you are.